It is now my pleasure to introduce Sherry Rogie-Fidler, President and CEO of Farm Foundation, and Ted Billier, Chief Strategy Officer for the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, who will offer their own welcomes as well as more information about our conference. Sherry?
Great, thank you, Martha. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this two-day virtual conference on trade and climate change. This conference is a joint initiative of Farm Foundation and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute and builds on recent collaborations between our two organizations, one focusing on trade and the environment in 2019, and one on managing trade in an increasingly chaotic world in 2020. We are so glad to have the opportunity to engage with you today as we build upon these critical conversations with new dialogues on issues at the intersection of agricultural trade and climate change. As Martha mentioned, my name is Sherry Rogie-Fidler, and I'm the President and CEO of Farm Foundation, located just outside of Chicago, Illinois. I'm also a fifth-generation farm owner-operator from Nebraska. Before we begin our conference, we would like to take a few minutes to introduce the organizations behind these dialogues. Farm Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and society to address the challenges that affect the entire food and ag value chain. Specifically, we are an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating people and ideas into action. The three levers we use to accomplish this are policy, innovation, and education. Conferences such as this are just one part of our extensive program of work, which is guided by our mission to build trust and understanding at the intersection of agriculture and society, and our vision to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world. We pursue programs and projects that align with our four strategic priorities, which you see on this slide: farmer health, digital agriculture, conservation and sustainability, and market development and access. People are at the center of everything we do as we strive to create multi-stakeholder and intergenerational collaborations on a local, national, and global scale. This conference on trade and climate change offers the opportunity for us to engage in two of our four thematic areas, with trade falling into market development and access, and climate change falling into conservation and sustainability, as well as the opportunity to collaborate with global partners like CAPI and the many national and international thought leaders you will hear from over the 2 days of this conference. You can learn more about Farm Foundation and our work by visiting our website at farmfoundation.org or connecting with us on our social media platforms. We rely on partnerships to fund our work and increase our impact. So if you're interested in learning more about funding or partnering with us, I invite you to reach out and explore collaboration. We are, of course, thrilled to be working once again with our partners at CAPI to bring you this conference. And so now I'd like to turn things over to Ted Billier to share a few comments. Ted?
Thank you, Sherry. Good morning. My name is Ted Billier. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, or CAPI, located in Ottawa, Canada. CAPI is pleased to partner with the Farm Foundation, again on critical conversations around global agricultural trade. CAPI is an independent policy think tank focusing solely on the agri-food sector, bringing insight, evidence, and creative solutions to agri-food policymakers by creating venues like this for critical conversations, explaining research results to a broader audience, and being a connector between those who have creative ideas to contribute and those who are making impactful policy decisions. You can learn more about the work CAPI is doing through our website or social media platforms. There are many ways to support the work of CAPI, and we are actively seeking funding partners on our work going forward. If you're interested in learning more or want to get in touch, please visit the CAPI website to reach out and start the conversation. We are pleased to host this two-day conference with 6 panels of excellent speakers from around the world, with diverse backgrounds to engage in critical conversations about topics at the intersection of global agriculture, trade, and climate change. Day 1 will begin with a focus on climate change policies and their impacts on agriculture production and trade. Session 1, Equitable Climate Actions, will look at the border carbon adjustment as a mechanism for leveling the playing field and reducing carbon leakage when different climate change policies across countries impact a country's competitiveness. Session 2, Climate Actions and Competitiveness, will look at the impacts of country-specific climate change policies on agricultural production, trade, global food security, and competitiveness. The findings of a recent ERS study analyzing the impacts of the EU Green New Deal on these issues will help set the stage of this session. In session 3, and our final session for day 1, Asia-Pacific Perspectives, panelists will discuss what challenges and opportunities they foresee given new and evolving standards and expectations for factoring climate change into trade agreements while ensuring food security. Thank you again for joining us for what I am sure will be a thought-provoking conference. With that, I will ask Martha to return to share some helpful meeting logistics. Martha.
Thank you, Ted and Sherry. As we get underway with our programming, I'd like to highlight a few reminders and helpful tips for getting the most out of our time together over the next few days. The Event Hub is your starting point for all sessions. You will likely be asked to log into the Event Hub each day using your email and password, just as you did to get here this morning. Once you're in the Event Hub, you will see a list of each day's sessions. Click the blue View Session button next to each session to join it. And remember, you must join each session individually. When one session ends, you must exit that session, go back to the Event Hub, and click the View Session button for the next session you want to join. We are very excited to have a suite of tools and technologies available to help this meeting feel as interactive as possible. We encourage you to use the Q&A function within each session that allows you to ask questions of the presenters. Our virtual networking lounge will be open throughout the day for both days of the conference and can be used for small group conversations and discussions. To join the networking lounge, join from the Event Hub as you will every other session by clicking the blue View Session button. Please be advised that the networking lounge is not tablet compatible. This means if you are using an iPad for the rest of the meeting, you will need to switch to a desktop, laptop, or phone to join the networking lounge. When you enter the networking lounge for the first time, you will be asked to input your name and email address. As long as you use the same device throughout the meeting, you will only have to do this once. Once you are in the networking lounge, you can join a virtual table to informally chat with others. There is a help desk in the bottom right corner of the screen that you can go to if you need any assistance in the lounge. Additionally, if you need assistance throughout the conference, you can email events@farmfoundation.org. Finally, if you are posting on social media during the event, please tag your posts with hashtag #FFCAPI. As a reminder on the schedule, all times listed on the agenda are in Central Daylight Time. Today's sessions end at 4:15 p.m. though the networking lounge will remain open until 5 p.m. Now it's time to get the conference sessions underway. For those who may have joined a bit late this morning, an important note about language interpretation that you'll hear many times throughout this conference. Each session of this conference will include simultaneous interpretation in English and French. Please ensure you have selected the correct language that you will listen in, either English or French. To select the appropriate language, please locate and click on the globe icon on the bottom taskbar of this window, or more if you are on a mobile device, and select either English or French. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our first session, Equitable Climate Actions. Claire Citeau is Executive Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance. I will let her share more about herself and this session's speakers, but would like to point out that you can access more detailed bios for all of our conference presenters in the Speakers tab on the event website. And please remember that you can use the Q&A function within this session to ask questions of our speakers. Our thanks to Claire for moderating this first session, and I'll hand things over to her now to get us started. Claire?
Martha, for the introduction. It's an honor to be part of this fantastic event that I usually join as a listener. As mentioned, my name is Claire Citeau, Executive Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, or CAPTA, as we call it, the national voice of agri-food exporters in Canada, supporting a more open and fair international trading environment for Canadian farmers, producers, food manufacturers. While CAPTA doesn't have an official view on the topics discussed today, of course, our members follow closely the issues of sustainability, carbon border adjustments, and related policies in the context of a global trading environment where climate change policies have become increasingly ambitious and diverse among international players. For a sector that is doing business in every corner of the globe, it's important to pay attention to what our trading partners, customers, and competitors are doing policy-wise, and how that might impact our own trade. So if you're from the agri-food world and you're listening today, you obviously see good reason to become better informed about the issues today discussed. And this is certainly how I feel and why I'm so interested in the topics. The overall objective of this session is for people to be better informed and equipped to make their own decisions. So here is an excellent opportunity to get knowledge, facts, and insight from world-renowned experts in the topics. Let's jump right in and get started with the first panel today. The session will focus on the potential scope, design, and impact of the border carbon adjustment, or BCA, that's being considered as a measure to level the playing field with a focus on how a BCA could disadvantage developing countries and hence the importance of technology transfer for more equitable outcomes. Given the increasingly ambitious climate change policies being introduced in the US, Canada, and the EU that target zero net carbon emissions by 2050, there is increasing concern about potential carbon leakage and the decline in competitiveness due to their more stringent policies relative to competitors. A quick point about the format for the session. I will first introduce the first speaker, Professor David Blanchard, who will speak about how green gas mitigation objectives can be undermined by imports, the use of border measures to address carbon leakage, key WTO provisions relating to the use of these measures, and alternatives to border measures adjustments. I will then introduce Aaron Cosbey, who will then cover trends and possibilities, BCAs in the EU, the US, and Canada, the various possible BCAs and their implications for the Canadian agri-food sector. And a Q&A session will follow. Without further ado, please let me introduce Professor David Blanchard. Professor Blanchard is Professor Emeritus of Agriculture and Environmental Economics at the Pennsylvania State University. And before that, he was head of division in the Directorate for Trade and Agriculture at the OECD and a professor of agriculture economics at Cornell University. I invite you to read through his bio for more on his career that covered a large number of areas, including international trade and trade policy, agriculture and environmental policy. He's authored a number of papers for the FAO, OECD, World Bank, a number of international institutions as well. He's also written books, including WTO Disciplines on Agriculture Support, Seeking a Fair Basis for Trade, Global Challenges for Future Food and Agriculture Policies, and Current Issues in Agriculture and Trade Policy. Certainly, lots of insights that Professor Blanchard can share with us today. And with this, David, we look forward to your presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Claire. And thank you also very much to the Farm Foundation and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute for inviting me to participate in a debate and a dialogue on some very important issues. So if we can put my slides up, right. Yeah, we can go to the next one now. Agriculture is unique in, I think, in many respects in terms of the climate policy debate. There's a huge challenge associated with agriculture. It accounts for a large proportion of global greenhouse gas emissions, even though it's a small proportion of world income, GDP. It's also a major source of two very potent greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide. And those gases pose particular problems in trying to control emissions from agriculture. Another important point is that developing countries account for a large proportion of global emissions from agriculture and other land use activities. So that's what OFOLO is, it's agriculture, food, and other land use. So that there's a big challenge, but There's also a big opportunity in agriculture because it's one of the sectors, the very few sectors, in which it's actually possible also to remove carbon from the atmosphere through sequestration. So I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on because it's an important part of the puzzle in how we address the issues in agriculture. Next slide, please. The policy context here, the overall context in terms of addressing emissions is that GHG emissions are an unpriced output. You know, we economists would call them a negative an externality. And obviously they're not taken into account when farmers or indeed consumers make decisions about the production or the consumption of agricultural products. Under the Paris Climate Agreement, there's no global price for GHG emissions. Economists, of course, would say that, well, if we price these, if we actually factored those into the production and consumption decisions, then we would address a lot of the problems. We wouldn't totally eliminate them, but we would certainly go a long way in dealing with the fact that these emissions are not priced. So if we don't have this global price, there is a possibility, of course, that we could have efforts to reduce emissions in a particular country being undermined by imports if other countries don't include the price of emissions in their export prices. So I'm going to focus primarily on the use of border measures in general to limit imports of commodities that could undermine these domestic emission reduction objectives. And as Claire has mentioned, a major issue is whether such measures are consistent with obligations under existing international trade disciplines in the WTO. Now, a little bit of a health warning here. I'm not a lawyer. I'm an economist. And the legal logic that's often applied to these trade policy issues is very different than the economic logic that we apply. So I'll make a few brief observations about disciplines in WTO, but I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about them because really, to be honest with you, there's a lot of legal unknowns about what's involved here. Next slide, please. Now, being an economist, of course, I have to show a few diagrams. I've tried to keep these relatively simple, but I need them to illustrate some very important issues. In this one, the top two panels show what's, in a very simple form, what might be going on in the production of a particular commodity. On the top left, we've got a domestic market in which supply does not meet demand. So on the right-hand top panel, we've got imports. That's the international trade part of this. Now in the bottom part, and this is where things get interesting, what I've done is to put in some emissions relationships relating to both to domestic production and to the traded good, the imports. And these are particular assumptions, they're simplifications, they don't necessarily have to apply, but I think they get an important question here. In the bottom left, we're looking at the domestic production. And what we're assuming in this particular case, that emissions increase more than proportionally in line with production. So this is a relatively high emitting good, whatever it is. And as you can see, that's why that red line that's down there is tilted more towards the horizontal axis. If it was at 45 degrees, there'd be an equal relationship between production and emissions. On the bottom right, we've got a couple of possible relationships with emissions in terms of imports. The bottom one, the steep line, is the case in which imports are highly emissions intensive. So they're actually giving off more greenhouse gases per unit of production than the domestic product. All right, that's obviously bad news for global emissions, if you think about it. On the top line, which is more towards the horizontal axis, then imports are giving less emissions per unit of production, which is obviously a much better situation in terms of global emissions. Next slide, please. So the big question, of course, is, well, what are the options for trying to address GHG emissions in general, and in particular in agriculture? Well, one thing, of course, we could do is let's internalize the costs, the emissions costs. And we do this through taxation, either at the point of production, or let's not forget, also it could be at consumption, point of consumption, or we use regulation, or we use some sort of mixed approach. And the most popular one that's used here is cap and trade, where we cap the total volume emissions, but we allow emitters to trade permits essentially between them. A second thing we could do is to provide financial support for the development and adoption of low emission production practices, or to promote the consumption of low emission products. So this ranges all the way from support for research and development on low emissions output, extension activities for farmers, all the way up to using some types of consumption subsidies even for low emission consumption. And then the final thing, which we shouldn't forget because it's very important, is we can try to change behavior. This is through knowledge transfer, provision of information, education for producers or consumers. And that's another important thing we could do. Next slide, please. In terms of the trade policy aspects here, the WTO disciplines are clearly important, and there are some very important principles in those that could figure in any sort of debate about the legality of how we address emissions policy. A couple are highlighted here: the non-discrimination between products, products that are viewed to be basically similar, regardless of their emissions content, would be like products. So it doesn't really matter what the emissions involved, for example, in the production of beef. As far as WTO is concerned, beef is beef, regardless of its contribution to emissions in production. A second thing is that we're not supposed to discriminate between domestic and foreign products through internal taxation and regulation. So those are pretty important when you start to think about using border measures to change the relationship between imports and domestic production. Now, there is a very important article in the GATT, Article 20, that does permit some exceptions. In other words, we can use trade measures, and they're outlined here. And people have said, well, maybe we could get special exemptions for the use, for example, of border measures to limit high emitting imports using Article 20. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I won't actually comment on that, but it's clearly an issue. So let's go to the next one. Next slide, please. An even more complicated diagram, but this is very, very important. What I'm doing here is in the top left-hand panel, we're putting a tax on domestic production in order to internalize emissions costs. What that does is it moves the domestic supply curve to the left. It increases production costs. And so we get lower supply at any particular price because of the higher cost. On the right-hand side, we're looking at what the implications of that would be for the international market. And we've got a constant world price, importers are importing at this constant price. What the tax domestically does is it shifts the demand for imports to the right, so that you can see that ED curve shifts to ED prime, because of course domestic demand has not been changed by the domestic emissions tax. It's only production that's been changed. So let's look at the bottom two panels here, in which we're looking at the potential implications in terms of emissions. First of all, the bottom left one. The fact that we're reducing domestic output of this product contributes to mitigation, right? We're having less emissions, as you can see, from E0 to E1. But what happens on the import side? Well, the question there, of course, is what is the emissions intensity of imports? If we are looking at very high emitting imports, that's the red line down at the bottom here, then clearly that's pretty bad news, because what we're doing is we're replacing lower emissions domestic production by higher emissions imports. On the other hand, suppose the imports are actually lower emitting than the domestic product. That's the green line up above. Then, okay, imports are increasing. And so in a way, we could say, well, there's carbon leakage. You know, imports are going up and there are emissions associated with those. There are carbon leakage. But there's a very important difference here. in the case in which high emissions domestic production are replaced by lower emission imports, then what we're actually having is leakage is leading to carbon reallocation. That's very important. We're actually saying, yes, imports go up. There are imports, emissions associated with those, but we're not actually having full leakage in the sense. We're having a reallocation towards lower emitting sources of products. So let's go to the next slide. So if we look at this leakage question, the fact that imports will change, the first point that I'd like to make is that if we're dealing with a switch to lower emission imports, then that presumably contributes to global mitigation objectives. We would, if we restrict them, we would actually increase domestic and global emissions, and that would undermine carbon reallocation. That was also shown on the previous slide, that domestic production increases if we restrict the imports. The second point is that differential tariffs, if we could use differential tariffs or import regulations based on emissions intensity, then that might very well be challenged in the WTO as being discriminatory or against GATT rules, absent some sort of exemption under Article 20. But indeed, if domestic emissions are taxed, could tax adjustments be applied to imports based on carbon content? Let's go to the next slide. This is where we get to the border carbon adjustments, or BCAs. Again, this is a pretty complicated slide. I apologize for that, but these are rather complicated issues. What I'm showing here is that we're going to impose a border carbon tax adjustment, and that will raise the import price, okay? So imports will be taxed based on their carbon content. And this could lead to different outcomes for exporters. And I've shown a couple of extremes here. We've got two suppliers to this country in this commodity. One, supplier A, has a very high level of emissions. So when we impose the tax, what we do is we price them out of the market. They're not competitive anymore. They don't ship to this country. Exporter B, on the other hand, is still competitive, right? Even though we impose the tax, the imports go down in total, but they're still shipping product to this country. What are the outcomes of this? Well, as you see in the bottom part, we are preventing carbon misallocation by keeping out the high emitting imports. We're getting some of the carbon reallocation by allowing the lower emitting imports. But on the other hand, we're getting smaller domestic mitigation because we're not getting the same fall in domestic output. So this is the sort of the logic that we would see by applying a border carbon adjustment. Next slide, please. Now, I think a very important point, though, is that I'd like to make is this. Okay, we could see that you could use a border carbon adjustment to reduce some of the distortions that might result from trade in terms of emissions. But are we really getting at the essence of the problem here? All right. Now, what I've done here is to look at a couple of activities, or three activities actually, and what the implications of changing those activities would be through internalizing emissions costs. All right. So case one, the private opportunity cost curve is basically just shows what would happen in markets if we didn't do anything about emissions. And as you can see, the advantage really is in producing activity A. If we use our resources in activity A, we get a higher output than using them in activity B. All right. But if we internalize emissions cost, and that's the social opportunity cost curve, we shift the balance of advantage now, right, away from activity A to activity B. You could say, well, is that really is there anything in the real world that corresponds to that? Well, actually, we did some work for OECD on relative emissions intensities. And I'll give you an example of where that's relevant. It's Brazil. Brazil can use resources in the production of beef, land resources in beef, or it's a very important poultry producer. Its relative emissions intensity advantage is in poultry. It's not in beef. So that would say, well, if Brazil shifted resources out of beef production into poultry production, we'd actually be better off globally in terms of emissions. Now let's look at case 2. This is where the uniqueness of agriculture comes in. What we've done in case 2 is to say, well, suppose we've got an activity C that not only does it reduce emissions when we internalize the emissions cost, but we can actually eliminate some emissions, in other words, sequester some carbon. That's what the green line on here does. Now you could say, well, wait a minute, how could that possibly be relevant? Again, let's go back to Brazil. Suppose Brazil shifted resources out of beef production and instead moved that land into sequestration activities, like trees, for example, right? Trees fix carbon, remove carbon from the atmosphere. That would actually be a major contribution to global mitigation, because we would be reallocating resources in a climate-friendly way. Next slide, please. So why did I show these two slides, these two cases? Well, the basic point here is if we're going to minimize global emissions, we're going to have to shift the global pattern of production in individual products based on comparative advantage, in which emissions are taken into account. The cost of emissions are taken into account. The problem is that if we selectively use border measures that deal with emissions intensity on a commodity by commodity basis, we can limit these shifts, all right? And that's not good. And so the point that I'd like to make is what the really important thing is to focus on domestic policies that change domestic resource use in agriculture and reduce emissions. And the domestic policy focus, and it should be a domestic policy focus, should be on comparative advantage in emissions intensity rather than absolute advantage in individual products. Next slide, please. Okay, so going back to trade, key trade policy issues, lack of a global carbon price really poses problems. Use of border measures based on imports with different carbon footprints may raise problems of WTO compliance, but there is an issue, which I've already highlighted, that products with different carbon footprints are not like products in terms of their implications for climate change. And so countries within the WTO may be interested or willing to create special exemptions, for example, under GATT 20, and that would allow us to address potential distortions that might result from high emissions imports. Next slide, please. But before I finish, I would actually like to say, look, if trade policy is not the answer, what sorts of things should we be doing in order to address the global emissions problem in agriculture? Number one, research and development and innovation. Absolutely critical. Why? Because it can increase productivity and reduce the emissions intensity of production. Absolutely important. If I had $10 billion in R&D public funds, I'd want to allocate at least $8 billion to emissions reducing innovations. That would be my number one priority. Carbon footprint labeling. Yes, we could do this based on life cycle analysis. Won't get into the details. The International Standards Organization is working on this issue. And this could intensify global mitigation if consumers are sensitive to climate issues and they respond not only to the prices of products, but to their carbon intensity, as revealed by labeling, then that could have a major factor in changing total emissions. Third, environmental provisions in regional trade agreements. Now, I don't think these have been used to date, particularly in this area, but they could be. You know, we could tailor these agreements with regulations or reductions, tariff reductions that favor trade in low-emitting products, for example. That's, in other words, for example, cut tariffs on poultry products more than you cut tariffs on beef. That's an example. The final one, technological transfer and special and differential treatment. This is particularly important for developing countries in order to shift the focus to low carbon production in developing countries and low carbon trade. Next slide, please. So I think I'm pretty much on time with my presentation. These are my final points. First point, climate policies that may seem to be okay, make a lot of sense from a national perspective, may not make sense from the perspective of reducing global emissions. Second point, technical and legal issues make it complicated to reconcile climate policy and trade policy. The potential for conflict in policies and between countries over these policies is very high. Third point, in general, global mitigation and indeed adaptation to climate change, which is something we haven't talked about, is facilitated by freer trade. But national policies in dealing with emissions need to be consistent with that facilitating role. And final point, if you haven't got it already, then I'm just going to make it one more time. The real priority here is for countries to focus on effective domestic policies to reduce national emissions in agriculture. That's the big challenge. Thank you very much. Final slide. This is a little bit of advertising. If you're interested in more of what I've written on this, then you can find my publications at ResearchGate.net, and I've highlighted a couple here. The second of which, incidentally, was written with my spouse, who's also an agricultural economist. Thank you.
Receiving some questions for you, which we'll address in the Q&A. We'll move on now to our second speaker, Aaron Cosbey, who is a development economist with 30 years of experience in trade, investment, and sustainable development, and 22 years of experience in climate change. He is currently the principal of Small World Sustainability Consulting and a senior associate with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. He also serves on Global Affairs Canada's Environmental Assessment Advisory Group and served as a trade policy advisor to governments and institutions around the world, including the former Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, the Centre for European Policies, the CETA, the Commonwealth Secretariat, Your Environment Canada, and a lot of other global institutions that have small acronyms like the OECD and numerous UN agencies. Aaron, we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, and thanks for skipping all the organizations with small acronyms. Delighted to be here. Thank you to both the Farm Foundation and CAPI for making this possible, and I think the level of attendance here makes it clear how urgent and timely this session is. I also want to thank David for setting up the conversation really nicely. I think that's a good foundation for what I'll start to get into. I'm going to focus more specifically on border carbon adjustment and talk a little bit about what the trends are. Actually, let's go to the next slide because that gives us an overview. So I'm going to give it first an overview of what BCA, border carbon adjustment, is, if that's possible, and then talk about the trends in the European Union, which to some extent has given rise to this conversation, and the US and Canada, the possibilities in US and Canada. Then I got to take a little bit of a dive into the design elements for BCA, and I think that'll answer some of the questions that have come up in the chat up to this point, or the Q&A that is. And finally, think a little bit about what this means specifically for agri-food sectors, both in Canada and the United States. So if we can move on to the next slide. Yes, so thanks. What is a BCA? The easy definition is it's a border charge, and it tries to make up for the fact that foreign products have not experienced the same costs under climate legislation that domestic products have. So if we have a carbon tax in our domestic legislation, we don't want, we may have imports coming from products that haven't experienced that the same carbon tax. You could also think about a BCA making a rebate of those charges at the border for exports. What's the point of a BCA? There are a lot of potential objectives to a border carbon adjustment. The first one is preventing leakage. In other words, David talked a little bit about leakage. Leakage is when your domestic legislation, your carbon tax, your emissions trading system, results in actually higher emissions outside of your jurisdiction. And that can happen because your producers relocate to other jurisdictions. It can happen because your domestic producers lose market share to foreign competitors. It can happen in other ways. But the basic idea is you haven't actually accomplished anything from an environmental perspective. All you've done is shift the emissions from domestic producers to foreign producers. And in the process, you've deindustrialized. So nobody wants that final outcome. There are also a couple of other potential objectives for border carbon adjustment that have been discussed. One is to pressure your trading partners to greater climate ambition. Another is to preserve the competitiveness of your domestic producers. Both of those would be highly illegal under trade rules if it came to an Article 20 defense, so they aren't often discussed. Leakage then is the primary objective usually discussed for border carbon adjustment. And just to be clear, the firms that are most vulnerable to leakage have two different characteristics. They need to be emissions intensive, so that whatever carbon price you're putting on them domestically actually hurts them. And they need to be trade exposed, so they can't just pass those costs along to consumers, because if they do, they'll be undercut by their competitors. Those two characteristics distinguish those firms that are vulnerable to leakage and the ones that will need protection from border carbon adjustment. If we could go on to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the EU. As I said, to some extent, they are the reason we're here talking about this today. The EU has put forward in its Green Deal an extremely ambitious plan to get to 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. This is the most ambitious plan of any jurisdiction globally. And their current system for climate pricing or carbon pricing is the emissions trading system under the EU. And in that system, they currently allow for free allocation of some allowances to try to prevent competitiveness impacts and leakage. That is going to become untenable. In the context of a rising ambition of that scale, free allocation isn't going to cut it. They're looking for some other mechanism that can protect them from leakage impacts and competitiveness impacts. So in some sense, border carbon adjustment, while I said it's about preventing leakage, the ultimate objective is to allow for greater domestic ambition. You can't be ambitious if all it means is that you're going to deindustrialize your country. So the EU needs something other than free allocation. The Commission has given itself a mandate to produce a proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism that means the same thing as BCA. It has various different names by June of this year. And that proposal will come as a group of 13 other proposals on the carbon or the climate plank of the EU Green Deal, a package called Fit for 55. Anyway, that'll be put on the table as of June this year. So that's a hot topic. At that point, the process looks something like this. That proposal will need approval from the European Parliament and from the Council. When that happens, it will be, and we fully expect it to happen, the system will probably be put in place by 2023. That's the target date anyway. I shouldn't say probably, it may be later than that. And the probability is we won't look at a fully fledged system originally. In the first instance, it will probably start with a multi-year pilot phase, just covering a few sectors. The key candidates here are cement and electricity. Maybe steel will be included. That's what it will likely look like, but we just don't know. We don't know what's going to happen in June, and we don't know what's going to happen in the negotiations that proceed after that point. Next slide, please. So what are the prospects for border carbon adjustment in the United States? As part of the Biden's campaign promise, he talked about carbon adjustment fees that would penalize low climate ambition countries trying to export their goods to the United States. After election, he didn't stop talking about that. The prospect was raised again in the USTR's 2021 trade policy agenda and annual report. And it was raised again in the roadmap for cooperation that came out of his first international summit with Prime Minister Trudeau here in Canada. So the problem is it's not clear what form that would take. Border carbon adjustment is, as is an accompaniment to some kind of a domestic climate price. It's like a tax adjustment, similar to a VAT, but you need an underlying tax to do an adjustment. There is no carbon price in the United States that you could be adjusting for. And most agree that there is very little prospect that the United States will anytime soon adopt a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, although there are many proposals to do so. So what kind of a form could a border carbon adjustment take in the United States? Again, it's not clear. One possibility is Section 232 tariffs based on national security considerations, and you'll probably be familiar with the tariffs that the Trump administration imposed on aluminum and steel, and instigated other investigations on during its tenure, for which there are still tariffs in place, 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum for many of the US's trading partners. So the US could say climate change is a national security issue. In fact, the Pentagon has said that, and it was said in Biden's executive orders. And therefore, on the basis of that national security issue, we need to put in place tariffs on certain countries. It's a very fraught issue, and we can get into it if you like in the Q&A, but the idea of doing this faces some severe methodological questions and would be politically explosive. But it's a likely issue. They'll do something, and we're not sure what it is, but that's a possibility. Next slide, please. What are the prospects for border carbon adjustment in Canada? In Canada, like in the United States, this issue has been raised many times. It was mentioned in the 2020 Fall Economic Statement. It was mentioned in the Strengthened Climate Plan, which is Canada's new grand strategy for dealing with climate change that includes carbon pricing. It was mentioned, as I said, in the cooperation roadmap that came out of the Biden-Trudeau summit. The feds at this point in Canada are preoccupied with carbon pricing. And they haven't yet turned their attention to border carbon adjustment. They are, of course, busy doing background studies on the impacts of border carbon adjustment, so it's part of their analysis and thinking, but they have only really started that thinking, that thought process. They're not very advanced on these questions. The underlying problem is Canada, like the EU, has adopted a very ambitious climate agenda. We will see carbon prices of $170 Canadian a ton by 2030. And in the context of that kind of ambition, again, you need something to protect your domestic producers from leakage and competitiveness impacts. It may be that we do see some sort of a border carbon adjustment mechanism, and it may, if we do, it will probably accompany our existing output-based pricing system. That's the carbon pricing system that Canada has imposed on its heavy industry, its high emitters. If we could go to the next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about what, to some extent, I got to apologize for not doing this first. What is a BCA? So when we talk about a BCA, that's a little bit misleading. BCA is less like a single instrument than it is like a decision tree. There are a number of places in the choice of design where you can go one way or another and come out with a very different instrument at the end of the day. That makes it actually, frankly, impossible to talk about a BCA in general, its legality under the WTO, its effectiveness at preventing leakage, its effectiveness at protecting competitiveness, without actually assuming something about its design. So let's go through what that design looks like. First of all, the policy mechanism. So what carbon policies are you adjusting for? Is it a carbon tax? Is it a cap and trade system? Is it some kind of a hybrid with like the Canadian system where we have output-based pricing and output-based allocation? The border carbon adjustment has to be an accompaniment. It's not a standalone instrument. It has to be an accompaniment to some kind of a domestic policy. Secondly, what trade flows are you going to cover? Are you just going to impose a cost on imports, a levy on imports, or will you also do a rebate at the border for exports as they leave? That last one is problematic in some cases under trade law and certainly from an environmental perspective, but in terms of protecting the competitiveness, if that's your goal, it's pretty important. Thirdly, geographic scope. And here the question is, once you put this system in place, are you going to exempt certain countries as countries on the basis of their policies? Are you going to say, And this was the course of action that the Waxman-Markey bill proposed in the United States in 2009. Are you going to say that we're going to declare, Canada will declare that the United States is climate ambitious and therefore is not going to be covered by the border carbon adjustment mechanism? Or are you not going to have any kind of exceptions like that at all? Fourth, under sectoral scope, what sectors are going to be covered? And this isn't just a question of the broad sectoral coverage. So typically when we talk about border carbon adjustment, there's a dirty dozen usual suspects. You've got steel, you got cement, you got aluminum, you got nitrate fertilizers, fuels, sometimes electricity, cement, pulp and paper. You know, so it's not just about the broad sectoral coverage, it's also about how far down the value chain do you go in those sectors. So some of those sectors have very long and complex downstream value chains, chemicals, for example, steel, for example. So where do you stop the coverage of the border carbon adjustment mechanism? If you just cast it at steel upstream, then you're just shifting the risk of leakage down to those people that are producing steel pipes and flat rolled steel. The next question is emission scope. And some of the questions in the chat asked, well, are we talking about covering emissions from transport as well? So there are direct emissions. That's the emissions that are produced just at the point of the producer. So within a farm operation, it's the farm gate. All the stuff that happens within the operation, that's direct emissions. Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are a form of indirect emissions. They're any emissions that are attributable to electricity that you purchase or steam and heat that you purchase, right? And then there's scope 3, that's all the other emissions. That includes transport emissions, right? In terms of getting the good to market. Most border carbon adjustment proposals up to this point have just talked about direct emissions. Some have also talked about scope 2, talking about covering the emissions from electricity that's involved in producing a good. Almost none have talked about scope 3 emissions. Certainly none have talked about transport emissions, and none have even talked about emissions embodied in the purchase of input goods. So it's usually a more narrow scope than that. On calculating embedded emissions, the 6th step, so when a good shows up at your border, if you've got one of these regimes in place, how are you going to figure out what the embedded emissions are in the good? Are you going to ask for actual data on production and the electricity that was involved and the emissions intensity of that electricity? That's one approach. The typical approach, the more pragmatic approach, is to just set a default benchmark and say we're going to assume that all goods that show up at the border were produced, for example, at the emissions intensity of an average Canadian producer or an average global producer in this sector, right? And one variation is to allow that the foreign producer could challenge that default with third-party certified data. Very important question, are you going to credit for foreign policies? So, for example, if the United States put in a system like this, would it give Canada credit for the fact that we have a carbon pricing system domestically? From an environmental perspective, you would think that would make sense because otherwise you're double taxing carbon. But it's like many of these steps, it sounds simple, but methodologically a bit of a rabbit hole. Finally, what do you do with the money? This is a great question. I mean, you can either keep it, the broad options are, you can keep the money domestically or you can send it abroad. And let's be clear, we're talking about a lot of money. The European Commission has actually budgeted for revenue from a CBAM between 5 and 14 billion euros in the next 5-year multi-annual financial framework. So we're not talking about chump change. Keeping it domestically, if we were talking about a WTO challenge, doesn't look that good because one of the key things you want to demonstrate in an Article 20 defense of a WTO challenge, David talked a little bit about Article 20, is that this is an environmental measure. So ideally, you would send it abroad to something like a green climate fund or a multilateral fund that deals with climate change or tries to help developing countries decarbonize, right? Because these things do have an impact on developing country exporters, right? But most likely, the politically most likely thing is that we will see the money kept by any regime that puts them in place. And the EU has said that they're going to keep it. Next slide, please. So now we come to the implications for the agri-food sector. Now, you may have noticed that when I talked about the usual suspects of sectors covered by border carbon adjustment, that agriculture didn't figure there. You may have also noticed that I said that the sectors that should be covered are emissions intensive and trade exposed. Well, agriculture is emissions intensive. So agriculture production in Canada at the farm level sits somewhere around production of bitumen from oil sands in terms of emission intensity. And on trade intensity, not quite as high, but also very high. Food processing is also extremely emissions intensive and very trade exposed. But you never see agriculture talked about as a candidate sector for border carbon adjustment. The Canadian case can illustrate why. Although we do have a carbon pricing system in place, we have output-based allocation. It doesn't apply. It applies to food processing, but it doesn't apply to farm operations. And we have a fuel levy, a fuel charge in place, but farm operation use of fuel is exempt. So, and the fact that farm operations are very emissions intensive relies not just on carbon emissions, but also, and more importantly, on emissions of methane from enteric fermentation, cattle and manure management, and nitrous oxide from fertilizer use. Those emissions aren't covered under the Canadian pricing system. So and unless and until they are, and until farm level operators start to feel the impacts of some kind of pricing system that includes them, you couldn't imagine an adjustment system that would protect against those kinds of costs. Until those costs are incurred, you can't have an adjustment that protects against those costs. Some sectors, though, within the agri-foods sector as a whole, are going to feel the pain. At a carbon prices of $170 a ton, even if you don't pay for your methane emissions, even if you don't pay for your own nitrous oxide emissions, you are using fertilizer as an operator, and that fertilizer plant will have been paying the levies and will be subject to carbon pricing. So costs of fertilizer are going to go up. You do have to transport your goods. If you're a grain farmer on the prairies, you've got to ship it by rail to the coast. Cost of transport is going to go up. So, you know, and food processors are going to be are energy users, and they're also users of the inputs from basic producers who are going to feel those costs. The costs get passed down the line. So when carbon costs get to $170 a ton, there is some exposure. There will not probably be protection, however. So the bottom line, you know, if I was a Canadian agricultural producer, I would be madly figuring out what my exposure is, and you know, in what parts of the value chain it rests, so that when the Canadian government comes out and says, we want to consult with you about carbon pricing, and we want to you know, propose a regime that protects domestic producers, I would have ready for them an answer that says, okay, here's how the agri-food system in Canada is exposed to carbon pricing, is exposed to leakage as a result of carbon pricing, and here's how I propose it might be protected going forward. And to be clear, and this is a nice closer, I'm not suggesting that border carbon adjustment is the only mechanism that countries can use to protect against leakage impacts and competitiveness impacts. There's a whole tool chest out there, and I think it's foolish to propose border carbon adjustment as the only protective tool of that type. But it's certainly going to be one tool used going forward. The European Union is going to use it. Canada and the US are considering it. And so while this is not an immediate need, it is best to be prepared, because in the context of greater ambition in Canada and in the United States, it's worth thinking about where those vulnerabilities lie and how we can deal with them. Thanks very much. I think that runs me out of time and runs me out of presentation. So look forward to the discussion going forward from here.
Thank you, Aaron, for sharing these insights and your knowledge and all of these facts. There is certainly lots to take in here. And I took also that there's also some unknowns given the politics involved, and I particularly certainly appreciated the comparisons of where the US, EU, and Canada are at on these issues. This brings us to the Q&A session, the portion of the event today. I do see that we've received a few questions, so let's get started with these, if you allow me. The first question will be for you, Aaron. Could BCAs or other carbon pricing policies be tied to a global minimum corporate tax, like the one proposed by Secretary Janet Yellen and the Biden administration?
So a border carbon adjustment, like any tax adjustment, has to be based on some policy. So think about value-added tax. It's imposed on your domestic producers. It's imposed on imports when they come in at the border, and it's removed from exports when they go out. That's pretty much a global regime of how that operates. The problem with trying to tie a border carbon adjustment to a global minimum corporate tax is that underlying corporate tax has nothing to do with climate. So, I mean, you could tie a tax adjustment system to the global minimum corporate tax, but that's some other animal. It's not a border carbon adjustment. It's just basically border tax adjustment, which is a legal instrument under the WTO, and we use it right now for value-added tax. So it could be done, but we're talking about a different animal there.
And please, Professor Blanchard, feel free to jump in as well here, if you'd like.
Just to make
our second question. Sure.
Yeah, just to make one observation. Aaron did mention the border tax adjustment, which is used to essentially to eliminate the competitive disadvantage that might be created by having a domestic tax, an excise tax, a VAT, or whatever. He also mentioned in his presentation that, when you do that, could that be applied in the case of carbon taxation? And I think it would be a very sticky issue, because think about it. You're imposing a tax domestically on carbon because it contributes to climate change, essentially. But then you rebate the tax on exports. If I was another country and looking at that, I would say, wait a minute, this looks a bit like carbon dumping to me, that you're basically making an incentive to export while you're trying to internalize the cost domestically. So I think that's a pretty tricky thing to look at. And actually, the other thing is that it's a problem with this stuff is that suppose we actually taxed at the point of consumption, right? In agriculture, it's hugely difficult to tax emissions directly. I mean, taxing methane emissions or nitrous oxide is really an incredible challenge. So suppose we tax consumption, right? Some countries have actually been talking about this, although they're not doing much about it. I mean, for example, Norway has been looking into the issue of taxing ruminant meat at consumption level, right, to reduce consumption. The problem that you run into there, of course, is that you also have to tax exports, right? Why? Because if you only tax consumption domestically, but you don't take away the incentive to export the high emissions good, then you're really going to mess things up. Now, I don't know about Canada, but in the US, that raises a particular problem. And since under the US Constitution, you can't tax exports. So, as Aaron suggested, once you start to get into the details of this stuff, once you get into the weeds, it gets really, really complicated.
Thank you both for this. Our second question, wouldn't a BCA have to only address price-based policies and not emissions trading, cap or trade? Cap and trade could be addressed with purchases of emissions allowances, but the prices are implicit and problematic in terms of setting taxes. David or Aaron?
I can jump in. So
please.
Technically, border carbon adjustment is, if it happens in in harmony with WTO law, it has to be a tax adjustment. So it can only be for a carbon tax. If you're adjusting for, that doesn't mean you can't set up some kind of a system like the EU is proposing to do that is combined with a cap and trade regime. They're calling it an adjustment mechanism. In fact, what it is they're extending their regulatory regime to also cover imports. But they're calling it an adjustment mechanism. And that would mean that an importer would have to buy allowances at the same price somehow calculated that domestic producers have to buy their allowances for every ton of GHG emitted in the process of their production. If Canada set up a system, it would have to do the same, because we don't have, arguably, it's not a carbon tax, it's a regulatory regime that large emitters have to buy allowances for. So yes, the answer is if it's strictly if it's a tax adjustment like animal, then it has to be accompanying a carbon tax. But you can also imagine extending a regulatory regime like a cap and trade to cover importers. And that's what the EU is planning to do. It's what Canada would probably have to do if Canada did it. To go a step further, though, the question from the US side is, could you have a regime that covered neither a tax nor a regulatory cap and trade type of regime? And that gets really tricky. How do you know, but very politically salient, because the US needs to do that, and the EU needs to think about how they can credit US ambition. Much more difficult legally, methodologically, politically, but politically a live issue, absolutely.
Thank you, Aaron. Professor Blandford, did you want to add to this?
Yes, just very brief. The thing that strikes to mind here, and Aaron mentioned this about, I'm not going to get into whether or not a particular approach is legal under the GATT, but looking at it from an economic perspective, you know, suppose you've got two countries and they're both actually imposing carbon taxes, and one has a level of carbon taxes much higher than the other country. Would that imply that you actually give that country a tax rebate on the imports? You know, because if they're applying, let's say, a $200 tax, which is going into their export price, but they're still competitive at that price, and you're imposing a $100 tax on domestic production, well, you know, actually they're being penalized because they're being more aggressive in carbon pricing than you are. And Aaron did mention the fact that, you know, maybe you could get credits for the level of ambition you have. That's true. But in this particular case, you know, I'm wondering, I don't think politically this would go down very well, because you'd be telling your domestic producers, well, you're not doing enough, and these guys are doing a lot more than you, so we give them credit for that. This raises you know, it's just another one of the operational problems that you run into with this stuff.
Thank you both for this. Question for Aaron. I think you made a reference to $170 per ton in your presentation. The question is, where does it come from?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I rushed through a lot of stuff, assuming, you know, if I had a couple of hours, I'd make a more thorough presentation. So this comes from the Canada's Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. This is the strengthened climate plan that the government put into law late last year. It involves two kinds of carbon pricing. One is a fuel charge on all kinds of any kind of fossil fuel, which is basically a tax, a carbon tax on fossil fuels. As I said, so there are some exemptions, and farm use is one of those exemptions. And it also involves demanding that large emitters submit or compensate for their emissions, but they also get some free allowances. But the price of carbon involved in both those schemes, the fuel tax and the output-based pricing system, is currently at $50 a ton and is scheduled to rise incrementally out to 2030 to $170 a ton. So that's the legally mandated price of carbon in Canada, if you will.
All right, thank you, Aaron. There is a question that was previously answered by David in the chat box there, and part of his comment says that you're probably best qualified to answer. So I'll ask you now, do border carbon adjustments take into account transport, fuel and time, man hours involved in export or import activities, and who pays the BCA?
So the answer, as I said, it's impossible to say what a border carbon adjustment does or doesn't do, because you have to make an assumption about what, a border carbon adjustment that covers transport costs would cover transport costs. A border carbon adjustment that doesn't wouldn't, right? So the typical border carbon adjustment that has been proposed doesn't cover stuff like transport costs. All it covers is the direct emissions that happen during the operation. In the case of a farm, it would be farm level emissions, and it might conceivably cover indirect emissions from electricity use. But nobody's talking about one that would cover transport of goods internationally. Although conceivably you could do that, but nobody's talking about that. That's very unlikely in my opinion.
Okay. David, did you want to add to this? No? Okay. Our next question, if the major economies of the world impose the BCAs, what is the impact to the economies of developing countries that have minimal resources or inefficient resources, but are currently exporting to have some cash coming into their country? It seems to potentially become even less competitive, and then the global economy will have to help support them in some ways to avoid potentially severe implications for the most vulnerable of their population. Professor Blandford or Aaron?
Oh, Aaron, you go ahead.
Well, yeah, this is a problem, and the empirical studies that have been done to try to figure out the incidence of an instrument like this have all come back and said the major impact is going to come from developing country exporters. And in developing countries, agriculture, in many developing countries, agriculture is a backbone of the domestic economy. Not only in terms of GDP, which doesn't really express the importance, but in terms of labor, you have so many people employed in the agriculture sector in developing countries, and the idea of putting an instrument like this in place that basically penalizes their exports seems unfair, because number one, those countries have done the least to contribute to climate change in the first place. And number two, are going to feel the major effects of climate change in a way that's much more acute than we're going to feel them, just because they're located in the tropics. That's just the physical reality of it. So the first part of the answer to the question is yes, you will see major impacts on people that don't deserve to feel those impacts. But the second part of the question is, what do you do about that? Because at the same time, if the EU, for example, doesn't take ambitious action on climate change, then and other industrialized countries don't, then they're ignoring their commitments under the Paris Agreement to be leaders on climate action. And in order to take ambitious action, they have to somehow protect themselves from deindustrializing and experiencing leakage. So you got this conundrum. How do you deal with that? Well, one way to deal with it, there are ways you can tweak the basic instrument. You could say you're going to not cover least developed countries. For example, you could afford them non-coverage. You could also say that you're going to send the money to some kind of a fund that helps in adaptation in developing countries, that kind of thing. There are ways to tweak it. However, let me come back to, I don't think this instrument will ever cover agricultural goods. So while it would be extremely unfair, while it would be very unfair for border carbon adjustment to cover agricultural goods coming from developing countries, I don't think that will ever happen. It will cover other exports from developing countries though. But if you look at the list of likely subject sectors, that is steel, aluminum, cement, chemicals, petrochemicals, nitrate fertilizers, pulp and paper, those are major export staples of most developing countries. The real pain to most developing country exporters is probably a carbon price on oil, not the border carbon adjustment that would protect against competitiveness impacts.
Yeah, if I could just say something about this issue, I agree with Aaron that agriculture is not likely to be covered directly. The issue here, though, is an important one in terms of how do we move developing countries from high emitting activities to lower emitting activities? What do we do there? And in some of the work that we did for OECD, we showed that, you know, in many developing countries, it's really a productivity question. Productivity in agriculture, even though it's a hugely important sector, is low. And so when you have low volumes of output per unit of land, for example, you often get very high levels of emissions. So the key issue here really is, how do we help developing countries to transition to lower emitting technologies? And there's tremendous potential here on the horizon. You know, we're already seeing that, for example, measures which improve soil carbon capture can increase in productivity in some cases, so that you lower emissions per unit of output. We can change livestock diets, and there's a lot of work going on here in beef, for example, so that you can actually reduce emissions per unit per kilo of beef that you produce. So the fundamental issue here really, in terms of lowering global emissions in agriculture, is a technology issue. And it's a technology transfer challenge. It's a technology development and a technology transfer challenge. And I think that's where we could help developing countries the most. And by the way, it doesn't help them that in some cases, the sorts of technologies that will actually lead to the greatest emissions reductions, like the use of biotechnology, are often prohibited in these countries. And so that's not going to help things at all.
Thank you both for this. Next question to both panelists. How do you view US climate change policies as being tied to the value of the US dollar globally?
I don't actually understand the question. Maybe David, you do.
No, I think maybe the what's being implied here is how might the U.S. policy affect the value of the dollar? In other words, that's a question presumably of how it would affect our competitiveness and the attractiveness of investing in the United States. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that if you want to encourage capital inflows, a very good way to do this is to be an innovator in green technology. Because if you're an innovator in green technology and there's a possibility of making that technology itself tradable, then you're going to attract foreign investment. So, you know, that would presumably affect the value of the dollar, at least keep the value of the dollar somewhat stable rather than having it depreciate against other currencies. But it's difficult to say. But in any case, if it's something about competitiveness of the United States versus other countries, then clearly the ability to be an innovator that will attract inward investment is a key issue.
All right, so if we stay on the issue of competitiveness here, our next question, if a BCA is not likely to apply to agriculture, then what tools can countries use to protect the competitiveness of the sector?
Well, I think David has talked about a number of good tools, including money going into research and development. So fundamentally, if what you're trying to do is be ambitious about reducing emissions and prevent that ambition from undermining the competitiveness of your sector. So let's focus on how you do that in the context of agriculture. One way you do it is through research and development, as David has suggested. So you come up with technologies that can reduce, for example, methane emissions from livestock rearing, dietary amendments, manure management practices. That's money well spent, right? And to the extent that the government can underwrite that kind of research and development and make those technologies commercially available at reasonable cost, that's one way you do it. Another way you could do it is through subsidization. So you might say, this gets controversial because anytime you talk agricultural subsidies, it gets political and trade economics is involved. But you might say that we are going to support our producers as they transition to low carbon practices like no-till, like precision farming, like the 4R application of fertilizers, right? If you view the benefits of that kind of practice as being some kind of an environmental externality, you internalize that externality by giving your producers a subsidy to change their practices. Or if you don't like subsidies, at least you deploy an army of agronomists out to the farm level to help show farmers how they can actually implement these practices in a way that both increases their bottom line and helps solve climate problems. So basically, if you're not going to go a BCA route, the trick is to try to lower the costs of improved practice at the farm level through a number of different techniques.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Just a couple of observations. Some of the work that's being done actually in countries, for example, in the UK, has shown that some of the emissions reducing practices that farmers can adopt are actually privately profitable, right? But they're not adopted because of insufficient information, so farmers don't really, farmers are fairly conservative folks for good reason. And sometimes it may not occur to them that, well, this alternative approach to my production could actually lower emissions. So the education thing that I indicated is important. The second point on subsidies, just like the fossil fuel industry, which also receives a lot of subsidies through tax advantages, agriculture gets a lot of subsidies. It receives a huge amount of subsidies, as pointed out by the OECD. Now, not all these subsidies distort production, but quite a few of them do. And one way, maybe, perhaps, of helping to mitigate the effects of agriculture on climate change is to get rid of the subsidies that actually promote the production of high emission products. It's as simple as that, right? You take away those subsidies, and that requires domestic policy reform. So subsidies are certainly on the table. If you're going to use them selectively to promote, under environmental programs, there are some things that could be very effective for agriculture in terms of reducing emissions. One of them would be to expand the sorts of programs that we have in the US under what we call conservation reserve, which is to take land that's currently, let's say, in the production for beef cattle and move it into much lower emitting activities, including trees, for example, planting of trees. So there's a lot of stuff that we can do here domestically.
Thank you. Our next question, how can carbon intensity per pound or per cubic feet basis of a product be used as an attribute, like a dollar value, to facilitate carbon-friendly carbon trade? There are well-defined methods to measure carbon intensity of a product, say product A at point of origin and at point of delivery, and it can be used as an input attribute for production of product B in the next step of the supply chain. So carbon intensity of a product being measured as an attribute.
Do you want to go first, David, or should I jump in? All right, so yes, we have, there are all kinds of good protocols for measuring the carbon intensity of a product. You got the greenhouse gas recording protocol, you got ISO protocols. It can be done. A couple of things about that though. One is difficult. And number two, so if we're talking about doing this as part of a border carbon adjustment, or if we're talking about doing this as a condition for trade in some way, whether it's a border carbon adjustment or something else, you're basically asking the exporter to undertake a great deal of work and cost that they would not normally undertake. Most countries don't have reporting systems for the kind of carbon reporting we're talking about. Canada does, the US does, the European Union does, but most countries don't. So you're asking them to undertake all this, and incidentally, you're asking them to probably third-party certify it, right? So number one, it's a huge cost. Number two, methodologically, not so simple. You got to go product by product, shipment by shipment. If you're talking scope 2 emissions, that's electricity, right? That can vary by time of year, depending on whether hydro is roaring at that time or more coal is used, right? It's something that has to be determined, and you know, to try to determine the marginal emissions intensity of electricity in a grid, which takes a number of different kinds of electricity sources in it, not easy. Can be done, is done, but just not easy. And number three, if you're talking scope 3 emissions, which is emissions emitted in transport, this can, you know, it starts bordering on protectionism to try to take those into account in a trade regime tool like border carbon adjustment. Basically, you're penalizing any good that wasn't produced in your country because it had to be shipped to your country. You know, the argument, the opposing argument could be, well, let's let IMO deal with pricing carbon emissions and shipping, and we just deal with our own emissions as they occur in country. David, you might want to add some more light to the question.
No, I think one thing to point out, yeah, we can measure Aaron is right. We can certainly measure the emissions intensity at various levels. It's not easy. It can be done. The point that I would make though is this, that remember the competitiveness, international competitiveness, even if we had taxes on emissions, wouldn't be solely determined by that, right? I mean, there is a competitiveness for an individual country, an individual product, depends on its productivity, the use of the resources that it has, and so on and so forth. So even if you were to impose a carbon tax, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to shut out those imports. You may very well have those imports because the exporter has a possibility of adjusting other costs of production to offset the tax. And we've seen this to some extent with the Trump era tariffs, right? What happened in some cases was that Chinese suppliers, for example, of consumer goods were able to partially offset the effect of the tariff by lowering their offer prices. You know, they had enough flexibility in their system to lower the offer price. And so the landed price of products didn't go up by the full magnitude of the tariff. So we have to bear that in mind too.
Thank you both. So let's bring this to the farm level. What would you say would be your top 3 takeaways for the farmers, producers listening in today, whether they are in British Columbia, Quebec, PEI, and worried about their competitiveness, and who have heard or read coverage about some of these measures being non-tariff barriers?
Who wants to go first on this one? I mean, I could jump in with the caveat that my background knowledge on trade and climate is a lot better than my background knowledge on agriculture. Okay, I didn't grow. I'm not a 3rd-generation farmer. I'm a policy geek, right? But so, if you want my opinion, at the farm level, what matters here, whether you're in Canada or the United States, is what kind of policies you want organizations like CAPI to argue for on your behalf. You know, so should CAPI and the Farm Foundation be trying to get the government to cover you under a border carbon adjustment? Probably not. But then what should they be doing to protect your competitiveness and try to ramp up climate ambition in your sector? And I think we suggested some of the ways that could happen. That is through farm level support at best management practices. It is through you know, encouraging research and development of the technologies that can help you decarbonize. It's through basic, you know, basic education about the you know, the benefits that David spoke about, where you can improve your carbon performance at the same time as improving your bottom line. Cover cropping, no till, right? These are 4R application. These are practices that don't just deal with the climate crisis. They also make your farm level viability a lot better, right? So the basic takeaway for me is figure out what your vulnerabilities look like as we head into a scenario in Canada of $170 a ton, and in the US of whatever that ambition looks like, and figure out where your ability to protect your competitiveness lies in that context. And for my opinion, it doesn't lie in border carbon adjustment. It lies in those kinds of programs that are going to make find those sweet spots where you can both improve your own bottom line and make contributions to climate change mitigation and adaptation at the farm level. I haven't even talked about adaptation, but yeah. David is somebody that knows more about agriculture than I do. Can probably flesh that out better.
Well, I think for not knowing much about agriculture, Aaron, you made some very good points there. The one thing that I would say is this, that looking forward, you know, and the EU has shown this in some graphics. If you go through from, you know, 2030, 40, 50, the likelihood is that agriculture is going to be the largest single emitting sector in the economy, right? I mean, if we solve the transportation stuff and we actually get emissions reduced in the high emitting industries, then agricultural emissions are going to become a larger and larger proportion of the total emissions. So I think the first thing for farmers to realize is they have got to be on board with anything that they can do to reduce emissions intensity in agriculture. They don't want to be opposing it. They should be supporting it. And as Aaron has said, a lot of the things that can be done, like, for example, precision agriculture, you know, in which we carefully control the application of fertilizer, it isn't just going to reduce nitrous oxide emissions to the atmosphere. It's also probably going to improve water quality. So you're going to have multiple environmental benefits, and farmers need to be able to push the agenda towards more environmentally friendly technologies, the generation of those technologies, and the adoption of those technologies. I think this is the key. Don't fight this stuff. Line up behind it and use it to your advantage. I think that would be my number one message.
Thank you. Thank you for this. Another question from a participant who would be interested in comments about how these potential tools feed into the global need to increase food production to meet feed a population of 10 billion people. We need to produce more food while at the same time improving environmental performances and carbon management. Who wants to take this one?
Yeah, actually, we looked at this issue in a great deal of depth in the study that we did for OECD on mitigation, which was on my last slide, and which you can find either through OECD or through the website. I think the basic story here is this: there is no conflict between increasing productivity in agriculture when we do that in an emissions-friendly way, you know, through technologies that reduce emissions. There is no conflict there with food security, right? I mean, this may well mean that within individual countries, there's going to have to be a shift in resources from the production of some products towards the production of others. And that can create challenges. It can create adjustment challenges. But there is no overall conflict here between having technologies that increase productivity and lower emissions per unit of output with food security. That's a simple story.
I think that's right, and is a good take-home message. But you know, to add a message which is not a good take-home message, I mean, we've talked up to this point about the adoption of climate-friendly technologies, which also improve the bottom line, and that's the low-hanging fruit. We have to get all over that, as David said. Get behind that. Why not? There are also going to be technologies which might not improve the bottom line, right? And in the context of really high ambition, we may have to go in that direction. And then the question is, how do you protect the competitiveness of domestic production while you go further, into those kinds of technologies. And then we get to, you know, stuff like farm to fork in the EU or whatever. So, you know, in the future, those are going to be the crunchy issues. The low-hanging fruit is obvious, and we need to go there. But just be aware that then there are trade implications of going further into the really tough competitiveness issues.
Thank you. Our next question. Is there a window of opportunity opened by the COVID crisis in which countries would agree to set a minimal production and distribution standards, which would then be conducive to include the climate issue? In other words, shaping a worldwide pact on sustainable food production and trade.
That would be nice. I don't see it happening. It's like the idea of a global carbon price. That's the first best solution, but politically, I think it's far from where we are today.
David, did you want to add to this? No? All right. As a follow-up question to Aaron, in response to an earlier question, apparently you did not address the impact of indirect costs coming down from covered sectors. Farmers are and have adopted many things already with no help. When global companies leave Canada for other locations, in particular reference to fertilizer production. This makes farmers less competitive again. How do you prepare for the indirect issues?
Yeah, that's a fair point. So it's true that farmers are not going to be covered under BCA and are not feeling the direct costs of Canada's pricing regime. I'm just talking about Canada here, but also relevant to other jurisdictions, right? But they will be feeling the indirect costs. If the cost of fertilizer making goes up at $170 a ton for fuel, fertilizer uses hydrocarbons as a feedstock, and they use a great deal of hydrocarbons in production. So, and you know, it may be that we even get to the point where we're taxing them for the nitrous oxide production they produce. So that then feeds down to the farm level where we're using inputs that are more expensive, but we have no protection. So this gets to the issue of sectoral scope that I talked about. Where do you cast the protection? If you just cast it at the upstream levels where all the emissions are taking place, nice. But then if you don't protect the downstream levels where the costs are passed, then you've just shifted the risk of leakage and competitiveness impacts to those downstream levels. I don't have an easy answer to that question, though. I mean, the question is right. How do you protect farmers against the impacts of those kinds of indirect costs? As well as the indirect costs of fuel price increases in transport. Even if they're not paying it at the farm level, they're paying it indirectly. I don't know how you do that. The European Union has a system of compensation for indirect costs from electricity for some of their major producers. It's a regime that tries to take into account these kinds of impacts. It's not a perfect system, and it's a controversial system, but in the context of high ambition, maybe we should be looking at those kinds of mechanisms for compensating for indirect costs.
Yeah, I think we are in agreement that the way things stand, agriculture is not going to be taxed directly for its emissions. It's too complicated, and it's fraught with all sorts of difficulties. We want agriculture to adjust to low emissions output, right? We want them to be able to reduce emissions from production. And a necessary part of that, of course, is really to internalize the cost of carbon. So when we talk about changes in indirect costs, what we're saying is, well, some of the costs of carbon have been internalized, right? If the price of fertilizer goes up because there's a tax on fertilizer production, then what we should expect, of course, is that farmers will economize on the use of fertilizer. And I've already said that there are ways in which that can be done through changes in technology. The other thing that we should be aware of is this. USDA did some interesting studies during the oil crises. When we had very large increases in oil costs. And what they found was that US farmers were very adept at finding ways to economize on the use of petroleum, through increasing efficiency. So, okay, you have a tax on fertilizer, but what does that do? That says, let's try to find ways to use fertilizer more efficiently, to use less of it overall. One thing on the fertilizer taxation that I do find problematic, however, is this. We're taxing inorganic fertilizers, right? But farmers also use organic fertilizers. So what does that do? That shifts the advantage at the farm level in using organic fertilizers from inorganics, because the organics are not taxed. And that's a problem because there's pretty good evidence that organic fertilization, simply going out and spreading manure on the farmland, is not the greatest way either to protect water quality or to lower emissions. So that's an issue that, it's an unintended consequence of increasing the indirect costs on inorganic fertilizers.
Thank you both for this. Our next question. Many of the low-hanging fruit technologies to mitigate emissions are often beyond the financial capacity of smaller and mid-sized farming operations, especially those fully exposed to imports. Will this speed the rate of consolidation in the sectors?
Well, it might. Yes, it might. However, Aaron talked about the use of, I won't call them subsidies, I will say financial assistance for adjusting. And, it is quite possible to say, look, a small farmer can't really finance this change in technology that's needed. If they had access to low interest loans or indeed a direct subsidy for the adoption of a particular technique, then they could do it. So I would think it would be very useful, in fact, very, very, very useful, to take a close look at the financial capabilities of different types of farms to make the investments and the adjustments that are needed, and where we see that we could really make a difference, let's say on smaller farms or farms producing certain commodities, let's use targeted assistance to help those people, because I think that would be a very efficient use of our money.
Yeah, I agree with that. So if, you're never pursuing just one policy objective, it's not just climate change and that's it. If all we cared about was climate change, then yes, it might actually make sense to have one consolidated, vertically integrated producer that did all of our production in North America, because at that level it's quite efficient to have environmental management systems and certification systems and in-house R&D. But that's not our only policy objective, right? We care about family level farms. We care about the viability of small agriculture. And therefore, I agree with David, we need to look at ways to make those kinds of technologies, those kinds of practices available to smaller farms and prevent the sort of undue amount of consolidation. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think I'm getting close to the end of my time here. Perhaps the last question will be trade related. There's been talks about domestic measures in certain jurisdictions not being consistent with WTO obligations. Are domestic policies and global disciplines on a possible collision course here? Overall, is there a role for the WTO to play?
Well, there's always a role for the WTO. The WTO is the system of rules that keeps us from the wild west of international trade. That benefits everyone, all right? To the extent we've got multilateral cooperation, it's a wonderful thing. Is there a collision course? Yes, I fully expect that when the EU puts its CBAM in place, somebody's going to challenge it, and we'll see it go to the WTO dispute settlement. That means a couple of things. One, we have the fundamental challenge that dispute settlement system is not operational at this point because we have no functioning appellate body. And until and unless the US decides to reverse its policy of not nominating members to the appellate body, any decision of a panel can just be appealed to the appellate body and then it goes into legal limbo. So that's sort of approximate challenge, but let's assume that gets fixed. We still have the problem of sending a measure like a border carbon adjustment to the WTO. There will be intense political pressure, right? It's a legal instrument. It's supposed to make a dispassionate legal judgment on the acceptability of a particular measure under WTO rules, but there will be intense political pressure applied to that judgment. It won't be a good thing for the multilateral system. It will provoke something like a backlash, no matter how it's decided. It will promote backlash that will be damaging to the multilateral system. So I don't see a good story here, but on the technicalities of whether the border carbon adjustment could be found legal under a WTO dispute, there's first, it's impossible to say, number one, because we don't know what instrument we're talking about, right? So it's possible that the EU could put in something that's entirely WTO legal and rather ineffective, or it's possible that they will put in something that's implemented in a way that makes it obviously WTO illegal. We just don't know yet. That's one. And two, there is no jurisprudence in WTO law. There's case law, and it's taken into consideration as they deliberate on the merits of a particular case, but we just don't know how they will rule. And the appellate body in the past has surprised us a few times in how they've interpreted things. So as to whether it's going to pass muster under WTO, we just can't say at this point for a number of reasons.
David, did you want to add to this?
Just very, very briefly, I think Aaron has really summed up the situation. I mean, ideally, you would want the Environment Committee, for example, in the WTO to actually look at some of these issues head on and perhaps make some suggestions as to what could be done to clarify the situation. Is that likely to happen? No, probably not. But we should be trying to move in that direction of obtaining greater clarity with respect to the treatment of these environmental issues.
All right, thank you very much both. It was so interesting. I wish we had more time, but I'm getting the hand signal that our time is up.
So thank you to Claire and our speakers for that excellent discussion. And for those of you who joined us late, our apologies for the technical difficulties, but we will be emailing you the link to this session. We'll be posting that on the Farm Foundation YouTube site as well, and then sending everyone an update on the code and access situation that we will resolve for the next session. A reminder that the networking lounge is open and is a great way to continue the dialogue in between sessions. So remember to join the next session, session 2 at 1:00 p.m. Central Time using the blue View Session button from the Event Hub. So we will see you then. Thanks, everyone.